Father Dan, it's over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so good to see everyone. Thank you for hanging in with us. For purposes of our discussion, it's going to be helpful to call to mind all of the virtues we've touched on in the course, and it probably wouldn't be bad to have them rolling around in the back of your head during today's presentation as well. So you might, just for clarity and ease of thinking later on, if you've got anything to write with, just make a note to give yourself a virtue list. There being prudence, which we talked about as facing reality, deal with the real, and then fortitude, which is the strength and resilience and the boldness for life. Then temperance, which is serenity and equanimity and balance, restraint, patience. And then we talked about justice, which, particularly in light of what we talk about today, it's giving everyone their due, but giving them their due as a beloved child of God, so that justice depends on loving God rightly and loving each other in light of that love of God. Then in theological virtues, we have considered faith as both an approach to or a context out of which we experience everything, and then as a way of interpreting everything. Um, Pope Francis calling it the light for the journey, the understanding of what this is all about. Then hope as being more the energy for the journey, hope being our aspiration for reality to finally live up to what it was called to be. And today we take up our last theological virtue. Three things abide, St. Paul said: faith, hope, and X. Paul's Greek word for X was agape. Then, for 1,200 years, X was rendered by the Latin caritas. When the Bible was first translated into English, it turned into charity, but charity is far, far narrower and shallower than agape or caritas would have meant. So modern translators more accurately translate the word love. It's something greater, larger, even than faith and hope, says Paul. And love is very large. It's complex. It's confusing. It means so many things. I love my wife. I love my children. I love the light of street lamps shining through leaded glass into our condo. And I love the way that the light falls on the desert in different ways at different seasons. Even if we keep it within the same category, say music, love doesn't seem to mean the same thing. If I say I love Rachmaninoff's variation on a theme of Paganini, and I love Vivaldi's Spring from the Four Seasons, do I mean the same thing, since the two pieces of music evoke such very different feelings? It isn't, you see, that I have no idea what love means. It's that I have too many ideas. The Episcopal Church speaks often these days of the way of love, but it isn't clear what we're talking about, partly because the English word love isn't adequate, and partly because the reality of love truly is so large, so rich, so complex. C.S. Lewis tried to tidy it up in an excellent little book, The Four Loves. He gave us the four main Greek words for love, defined them, and then arranged them in a coherent order. First is philia, friendship between people who understand and enjoy each other. Second, storge, family affection with its qualities of loyalty and mutual support. Third, eros, which is romantic passion. Fourth, Paul's word, agape. Following the earliest theological tradition, Lewis said agape is unconditional, universal, spiritual love, equal regard. Everything is equally okay in my book. And Lewis asks, is agape the root or the flower of the other loves? And he answers, it is both. Agape is the essential foundation for philia, storge, and eros, but the practice of philia, storge, and eros is fulfilled, perfected, when we enter into agape. Now, the four loves is helpful. It's a neat, clear recipe for a happy life, but even it is too small a description of love. First, it doesn't mention the appreciation of beauty, which in the early church was the core of what we meant by God. Lewis doesn't have enough of adoration for the transcendent God. Second, it doesn't have enough of the cross in it. We get closer to the cross with Ronnie's words from the movie Moonstruck. Ronnie said, "Love don't make things nice. It ruins everything. It breaks your heart. It makes things a mess. We're not here to make things perfect. The snowflakes are perfect. The stars are perfect. Not us, not us. We're here to ruin ourselves, to break our hearts, to love the wrong people and die." That, I submit, is closer to what Jesus did, loving Judas and dying for the likes of you and me. Third, the four loves are really more ambiguous than Lewis shows. He makes storge, family affection, sound nice, like Little House on the Prairie. Well, Laura Ingalls Wilder's actually family life included that love, but along with it came a lot more shame, anxiety, and broken relationship than we see in the children's books. Jesus was positively against storge, maybe because his mother and brothers were trying to have him committed to an insane asylum. As for philia, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thomas Carlyle praised it as a beautiful thing where we really come into ourselves, but John Ruskin would have none of it. He thought we lost ourselves in friendship, said what our friends wanted to hear until we didn't even know our own hearts. As for eros, just read Anna Karenina, Madame Bovary, or A Winter's Tale. Romantic passion is a mixed bag. It's supposed to be the key to happiness. Barbara Streisand sang, "A feeling deep in your soul says you were half, now you're whole." But it's never that simple, and it can go way off track. Scripture portrays eros positively only in the Song of Songs. And since then, even Bible-thumping literalists have insisted that the Song of Songs isn't to be taken literally. It isn't really about eros, it's a spiritual allegory. So if love includes the cardinal virtues of prudence, fortitude, justice, and temperance, that helps. But still, erotic love is erratic love. It's a dicey business and a shaky foundation for a religion. Agape is the main word for love in the New Testament, but it appears so rarely outside the New Testament that we aren't sure what it means. I suspect the early church borrowed from Epicurean philosophy the virtue of loving something just for the sake of its being. Agape came to mean unconditional, universal affirmation of being itself, which leads to equal regard. Since all that matters is that something exists, all things are just fine with me. Well, sign me up for all four kinds of love and for Lewis's excellent book, but he hasn't covered the ground. Where in the four loves is delight in Monet's water lilies, or the proper love of ourselves. Well, I won't cover the ground either. Love is too big, too deep, too rich, too complex. But I hope to offer a few thoughts that might help us practice the greatest virtue. The crux of Christian love is the great commandment. When a lawyer asked Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" Jesus quickly gave the textbook answer, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength." But he didn't stop there. He said, "A second is like unto it," meaning it is of equal weight. The two are inseparable and interdependent. Love your neighbor as yourself. The lawyer replied, "Okay, then who is my neighbor?" Jesus answered with the story of the Good Samaritan, in which the neighbor turns out to be a stranger from another country, a man of the wrong nationality, the wrong race, and the wrong religion. If Jesus had been talking to Myanmar Buddhist, it would have been the story of the good Rohingya. Jesus says, loving that stranger neighbor, what Emmanuel Levinas calls the other, is part and parcel of loving God. His great commandment and the Good Samaritan story are not the final word on Christian love, but they are the first word. Everything depends on them. Christianity's defining voice in the late 4th century was St. Gregory of Nyssa. Gregory, his brother, St. Basil the Great, and St. Gregory Nazianzen, the three amigos of patristic theology, gave us the last third of the Nicene Creed, which finally portrayed God fully as Trinity. Two basic practices shaped Gregory's theology. The first was dancing mysticism. Monks in his part of the world danced their prayers in the same circle dance that we see performed today by Sufis. Gregory and his partners taught that God is the perichoresis, the ultimate circle dance. Through dancing prayer, they experienced the true, the good, and the beautiful as one. They loved God in the sense that they desired God, wanting to be with God, lost in wonder, love, and praise. They saw God's godness as an attractive, compelling choreography of beauty. The aesthetic was at the heart of spirituality. Modern theology lost that sense of God as beauty. Then two great 20th century theologians, Hans Urs von Balthasar and Jacques Maritain, brought it back. Three others have spread the word. Orthodox theologian David Bentley Hart, Episcopal theologian John Westerhoff, and Natalie Carnes, the friend of Father Joseph Wozniak. We love God with all our hearts, not as a grim duty, but because God is both the source and the summation of everything that transports our souls into awe and delight. St. Gregory's other practice is just as essential. Along with his brother, St. Basil, and their sister, St. Macrina, Gregory was devoted to the sick and the poor. Homeless beggars, lepers, and plague sufferers roamed the streets of Nyssa. Gregory took them in, but here's the key, it wasn't out of pity. Gregory saw God in them. He saw their beauty. He saw them as Jesus on the cross. The problem with beauty is that the rich can buy it, possess it, and define it. But Gregory rejected that elitist understanding of beauty in favor of finding beauty in the oddest places especially the downtrodden. A generation later, St. Augustine became the all-time principal voice for Christian love. He was a passionate man, if ever there was one. He struggled with a demanding father, a controlling mother, and a lost romantic love. Perhaps most of all, he loved his son, Adeodatus, who died as a teenager. Augustine was an intellectual giant, but his words are full of feeling. He combined the dispassionate Greek agape with the passionate Greek eros to give us the Latin word that would mean Christian love for a millennium, caritas. He also, by the way, used as a synonym delecto, meaning delight. Like Gregory, Augustine understood love as our response to the draw of the beautiful. The beautiful is awesome, beyond our grasp, but the incarnation has brought the beautiful to earth and established a link which enables us to commune with God. Augustine made caritas the prime virtue and overarching theme of Christianity. But to understand caritas, we need to contrast it with its opposite vice. We might expect it to be a Latin term for hatred, but it isn't. Augustine's opposite of caritas is cupiditas, or cupidity. We associate with cupidity with sex, even though that's not its definition. One reason is that the root is the name Cupid. The other is that Augustine was so conflicted about sex. A footnote, there are two reasons for that. First, Roman philosophy in his time regarded everything physical as fallen, and Augustine had spent his younger days in that brand of philosophy. In becoming a Christian, he rejected that world-denying attitude, but he never really got over it. Second, he had abandoned the lower-class woman he loved under pressure from his mother, who wanted him to marry up. He didn't marry up, but sexual frustration led him to take a mistress, so he felt guilty about betraying his first love. But even for Augustine, cupidity was never fundamentally about sex. It was about the compulsion to possess something for oneself. Suppose an art lover looks at a work of Michelangelo and takes delight in it. Now suppose an art collector looks at the same painting and thinks, I must have that. Make it part of my collection. Owning it will make me more important. The art lover is practicing caritas. The art collector is practicing cupidity. It's the difference between enjoying the other for being other versus using the other for oneself. Augustine said, caritas is the only source of good actions, and cupidity is the source of all evil. When Augustine said original sin, he meant cupidity, not libido. Original sin disorders our love. Caritas curves upward toward God. Cupidity curves downward, away from God. Augustine had read 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, no good work or spiritual power matters unless it is motivated by love. Now, Paul didn't define love, but he says a bit about what it does and does not do. It's a laundry list of virtues. Paul says, love believes all things. that's faith, endures all things, fortitude, hopes all things, hope, is patient, temperance. Augustine says that love is the sine qua non of justice. Love of God and neighbor are essential to a just society. Without them, no person and no political structure can be just. The centrality of love led Augustine back to the Great Commandment. He said it is impossible to love the neighbor rightly without loving God, but we need to start with loving our neighbor as generously as we can. The moral practice of loving our neighbor is our path to God. In the course of loving God and loving other people, Augustine says, we come to love ourselves rightly. We love ourselves not for whatever it is we might be proud of about ourselves, but for the sake of being lovers who discover God in our very loving. Flash forward 500 years to a couple of star-crossed lovers who were not saints. Peter Abelard was a handsome, charming philosophy teacher. He had an affair with his student Heloise, who gave birth to their illegitimate son, poetically named Astrolabe. Then they married secretly so as not to end Abelard's church career. But Heloise lived with her uncle, who abused her because of the scandal. So Abelard helped her to escape to a convent for safety, like a domestic safe house. The uncle and his thugs then castrated Abelard. Heloise became a nun, saying she took the veil not for love of God, but for love of Abelard. Yet they never stopped corresponding. Their letters are a classic of medieval literature, and Abelard's theology was influenced by the brilliant Heloise. His understanding of the cross was shaped by their tragic love. The prevailing view, then, saw God as a kind of tyrant whose honor demanded that every sin be paid by a levy of suffering. Abelard saw the cross quite differently. Life hurts, that's how it goes. But God loves us too much to sit by serenely in heaven, watching our ordeal like a mixed martial arts contest. On the cross, God joins us in our suffering. That display of love evokes our love in return. Such love carries us through and beyond the pain of mortal life. Divine love for Abelard is compassion, suffering with, and it is our responsive compassion that saves us. Abelard's and Heloise's understanding of divine love finally got traction in the 20th century with the Spanish theologian Miguel de Unamuno. He believed that love is essentially compassion, and that compassion is the way to wisdom, to connection with reality, and to union with the suffering God. Unamuno said, "Love is what is most terrible and tragic in all the world. It is necessary to love something in order to know it. And this means to know something, it is necessary to have compassion towards it. It is necessary to suffer with it." That's the theology of Moonstruck. Love don't make things nice. It ruins everything. It breaks your heart. It makes things a mess. Christianity is not a sedative to smooth us out. It's an invitation to life, and life isn't smooth. But love isn't just compassion. It's also delight, wonder, appreciation, and so much more. Dante shows us how that kind of love leads us to God. Romantic love is his example, but what he says applies to all the numerous and diverse kinds of love. In the Divine Comedy, the middle-aged Dante, lost in a dark wood, was not consciously longing for God. He traversed hell and purgatory looking for something, he did not know what. But he was, from the beginning, decidedly in love with Beatrice Portinari, who had died at the age of 25. Finally, after his journey, at the threshold of paradise, who does Dante meet? Beatrice. It is Beatrice who demands his confession of having abandoned hope. It is then Beatrice who guides Dante into heaven and the beatific vision. Hans Urs von Balthasar explains Dante's point is that personal love is our path to loving God. He says, "For the sake of infinite love, it is not necessary to renounce finite love. On the contrary, Dante can incorporate his finite love into that which is infinite, but at the cost of terrible suffering." When Dante meets Beatrice, she is veiled. After he confesses his sin of despair, the angels plead with Beatrice to unveil her face. They sing, "By your grace do us the grace of unveiling your mouth, that he may behold in you the further beauty that you hide." Theologian Ann Carpenter explains that Dante loves the Beatrice he can see, but she is more than that. She is more than herself, more than a woman, and Dante is more than a man. Quote, "Dante and Beatrice are themselves and yet more than themselves," Carpenter says. That's why their encounter is so charged. Each individual is indeed a unique individual, but each of us exudes a penumbra of the universal. Each is an image of God. To see God, we have to look through the lens of creation, especially each other. St. John said, "No one has seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us." Dante is in line with St. John. So where do the followers of Dante and St. John look for God? In the world, in art, in music, and above all in people. But they do not just look at the world, they look through it into the mystery, knowing, sensing, feeling there's more there. They love God by savoring things sensibly, but with an awareness that what they're savoring is a transitory foretaste of eternal beauty. We long for that beauty, desire it, need it, as Augustine did. Love is wanting that beauty to exist, even though we cannot possess it. Love is wishing beauty well, as we wish our foretaste of beauty well. Von Balthasar, however, said that Dante also missed the cross. Dante traverses hell to reach paradise where Christ dwells transcendently beautiful. Dante's hell is defined as the absence of God's love. He has forgotten Jesus' descent into hell to harrow it with love. Von Balthasar insists, with Abelard and Unamuno, that God's love descends to the depths of suffering with us. So love is enjoyment, delight, appreciation, and well-wishing, but it is also compassion, feeling the world's sorrow. It isn't a sedative for happy-mindedness. It is a stimulant for life in all of life's rich complexity. That's what makes love the greatest virtue of all. For our discussion, since love rather brings it all together, I'm hoping in our discussion we can think back over the virtues and ask ourselves each personally, what is the virtue that seems to be our growing edge right now? Of course, as we've learned, the virtues are interconnected, so you can't practice one without practicing them all. But at any given point in life, uh, one virtue is likely to be more on our front burner. So these are special times in which we're living. These are times of pandemic, political discord, recession, challenging times. So the question really is, in today's context, for you in your life today, what are you feeling is the virtue that is the most front burner important for you? And what do you need in order to be able to practice that virtue more strongly? So we just have about, how many people do we have, Mary Kate? About
Well, there's 13 screens, but a lot of screens have more than one person. So I think it's, to me, I'd suggest dividing into two rooms.
got it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to stop recording and do that.